I'm very excited to have my guest, Justin Gillespie. Am I saying that right?
It's Gillespie, but
Gillespie.
everyone pronounces it the way you do, so it's like
Gillespie.
I might just start doing it the other way.
um, my bad. We are both from the Motor City. We're both representing here. Justin, you are the primary therapist owner with your wife of the Superior Center in Plymouth, Michigan, for people with ADHD. I was medicated for ADHD when I was young, and I've got my own issues. We'll start with we want your advice if your kids have ADHD, how to support them.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, one of the first things that we do with a lot of our parents, especially with teens, we really want to get the parents involved with the therapy. I'm a firm believer, especially with children and teens, that, the executive functioning management and the symptom management that we have with ADHD, it doesn't necessarily work unless you have the parents that are on board, since they're kind of the ones emulating the structure in the home. It's also kind of like if you leave it up to a child where the prefrontal cortex isn't fully formed yet, right?
Mhm.
They're going to want to act on their impulses completely. There is little to no sense of, critical thinking, abstract thinking, depending on the age and development right now. So we have to kind of get the parents on board with our treatment plan in order to see success with the child or teen.
And so, what does that look like? Creating a structure in the home.
Well, it depends on the child, right? So we
Mhm.
first have to assess the needs of the child. So for some cases, it's schoolwork needs to get done. The classic thing we always hear is they're very smart, they're very intelligent, and they focus on the things that they want to focus on, and they do them very well. But when it comes to schoolwork and homework, they don't do very well on it. It's kind of like no child really wants to do schoolwork, obviously, but it's kind of like with ADHD, we tend to just not do it because we have all these other interests despite other consequences happening with us. With other kids, they tend to be able to at least pull it together and kind of get through it as much as they can and what have you, much more than we do usually. So sometimes we have a homework structure where we have a new routine in the home, or right as they get in the door, or maybe an hour after they get in the door, after they transition or something, right? Depending on the child's needs. Sometimes we're dealing with anger management, because that's a big component with ADHD as well as with emotional regulation. So we'll have to come up with a plan for the parents where traditionally they're acting on impulse rather than having a structured plan in place for the child's emotional state. So we'll help them come up with a plan that's tailored to that child's needs. So really it's about figuring out what the child actually needs and then having the parent come in as a partner rather than an afterthought, right? Because sometimes
Mhm.
what happens with therapy with kids with ADHD, let alone kids anywhere actually, is one or two things. Either we focus solely on the child and we build all the skills with the child, and then we send that child out to the world to go practice those skills, and the child's just not going to practice the skills. And then the other part of it comes down to is a lot of times you'll have the child in session, the parent will be there with you, and then a lot of therapists will just talk with the parent. The child's just kind of there, right? So you kind of
Mhm.
want both to be there in a sense. Even if you're working with the child primarily, you still want to bring in the parent for sessions at least every other time or even once a month, and actually have them as more of a collaborator, but not have them taking over things.
You either have a parent in the room doing all the talking, or the parent that's sort of like, fix this kid.
Right, exactly. We try to bridge that gap a little bit by just showing, hey, like you're equally as important to this process as your child is. I kind of look at the parent more so as an anchor as well as more of a partner rather than the authority figure. That's probably one of the most important things when it comes to working with children and teens with ADHD is having the parents actually have buy-in, right? So it's kind of like you have to figure out, are you all a good fit for one another, which thankfully with the way I do my marketing, thankfully we've had a lot of people who are a good fit for me. They've been a good fit for people on my team. I've sort of transitioned into more working with adults with ADHD now, the young adults with ADHD. But like when I was working with children and teens, I definitely needed the buy-in from the parents. It was extremely helpful, and I noticed a significant difference in progress for parents who had buy-in versus those who didn't.
That's important because I don't specialize in ADHD. I specialize in anxiety, but I think they're similar in
Yeah.
that straight talk therapy doesn't necessarily work.
Now with ADHD advancements, right? I feel like there's so many new styles of therapy that people are being introduced to, whereas straight talk therapy has it's been helpful for some, but not everyone, right? So now there's people going to therapy for EMDR for ADHD now, right? Some people are doing more somatic approaches. I kind of take that talk therapy style, but I take it more as a coaching style, an executive functioning style approach. So there is some structure to it with it still being person centered. It's not
Uh-huh.
just more, hey, what's going on this week for you, right? We
Uh-huh.
do check in on that a little bit, but what I like to do in the first or second session with every client is I like to do an executive functioning inventory where we go through 10 different skills. So these are skills like flexible thinking, emotional control, attention and focus regulation, impulse control. And then what we do is we take the strengths of that inventory, and essentially we tailor the treatment plan around the strengths. The other
Mhm.
thing that happens too is I like to think of these executive functioning skills as a web rather than 10 separate skills. So if you lift up, let's say, flexible thinking, you're going to naturally be lifting up your emotional control. You're probably also going to be naturally from there, since you have more emotional control in your life, you'll be able to plan and prioritize now because your anxiety and your spiraling thoughts maybe are kind of not there as much anymore. At least they're more controllable. So that's kind of how we do it. And there's a lot of different ways that some of our other therapists will do stuff too. But that's kind of like some of our main approaches.
Do you ever find that parents are resistant or defensive to any of the suggestions?
I did when I worked in a group practice. So this is where people would. I worked basically for a practice where clients were assigned to me more so, right? When I started doing my own practice, I noticed that it's been significantly less and less just because I have more control of my marketing, I have more control of the output, right? One of my values in my business is transparency. So, I mean, even with my marketing values, even now that I have a group, right? I try to only hire people who are really in line with our values, with the way we do things. So it's kind of like when we do our marketing, when we do our website, you have a decent idea of like kind of like what you're getting into, even with me, from like the way I dress to the way I speak to the way I
Yeah.
act. Like it's very much on board, which I always find it funny because if anyone goes to my social media, I'm very much making content for adults. There's a lot of F
Hmm.
bombs I drop. So I was always shocked when even today, now they work with adults. There's people who are like, "Can you still work with my child?" And I'm like, "Okay, well that's cool. Like we can do that." And I'm obviously not doing that in session with them, but it's just one of those things where like parents typically know what they're getting into with us at least.
Yeah, and if I could say, it's actually inspiring to me, and it's cool to see you're yourself on your social media. So if you check out Justin and you're on TikTok, Instagram, where else?
That's it right now. We're developing a YouTube channel, which will probably be announced in May or June. But if you want to go to TikTok or Instagram, it'll be on there when the details are ready.
Yeah, you're very much yourself, dropping F-bombs, giving your opinions, having fun,
Mhm.
and obviously parents aren't freaked out by that.
They're not, and the ones who are, they probably don't come to us, and that's okay,
Yeah.
right? We're here about being ourselves. We're here to do that. So we're not going to be the ones that have buy-in from that. And honestly, they sometimes will find their own therapist, and they do find better results that way too, and that's totally fine.
Yeah.
But
It,
we're very much here about being your best neurodiverse ADHD self. So I mean, there's a lot of adults who have ADHD that obviously go and start to have families and things like that. And so something that's being discussed more and more lately is the genetic component of ADHD, right? So
Mhm.
give or take, depending on what studies you look at, between 75 and 80% of people who have ADHD, they're going to have a child with ADHD. And that actually correlates with when a child has ADHD. So there's a big genetic component. So there's a lot of parents out there who, and these are the ones I work with, I usually get 20 to 30 is usually like my median range, somewhere in there. But I get a lot of parents, and especially newer parents, anywhere between newborn all the way to like 5 or 6, that realize they are having like a lot of executive functioning challenges now, and they did not think about it before. A lot of the times things were minimized. Something I
Right.
always say too is that as we go back through their assessment cycle and things like that, we realize that there were challenges in school that they didn't think about because
Uh,
there were teachers in their life who they came across, and they were accommodating, and they were okay with work being turned in late, and they were okay with being patient with them. And so because of that, they weren't labeled a problem. That's how I want everything to be set up. I hate the fact that in our field we have to have so many formalized accommodations. I feel like if you're just struggling with something and you can identify it and there's a reasonable solution, why do you need all this documentation to go get it regardless of a diagnosis or not? But the challenge of this is they went throughout a lot of their life not having an ADHD diagnosis and weren't prepared for it. So now they're getting into their adulthood and they're realizing I have had challenges in my life that were already accommodated to. And then on top of it, ADHD is more managed in childhood and your teen years because typically there is more structure in place. So
Mhm.
the things that you might not notice in childhood and your teen years and other things that were just purely dismissed. And that's the good end of the side when you're diagnosed late. There's a whole other side of implicit bias that goes into that too. But besides that, you're going to then have these new challenges that you just were not prepared for with somebody not directing you to do things anymore.
Mhm.
It's not as easy for them to just pick up on things compared to other adults. I often say that ADHDers, we often feel like we're still children up until the age of about like 25 to 30. And
Uh-huh.
that's because with our brain development, there's certain parts of our brain that develop a little bit slower than other parts of other, neurotypical peers, right? So I
Uh-huh.
always say this, I'm like 30 years old and I'm just like in the last 2 or 3 years, I'm just now feeling like a semi-young adult for the first time that
Yeah.
somewhat has things together a little bit.
And I never thought of it as sort of an ADHD quality, but I am starting to reassess myself. Yeah, I have a therapy colleague I walk with, and her husband has ADHD, and she's drawing similarities. And I think when you have those particular issues, you tend to carry around some self-esteem stuff about
Yeah.
your executive functioning in general.
Oh yeah. If you're, in your 20s and you're seeing people around you who are maybe even are either your age or are younger than you and they're achieving more than you and their house is more organized than you and there's other things about them that they're doing, then objectively, right, if you see it from that perspective, you're just going to be like, wow, I'm like really behind on things in life. The thing that's not talked about though is that people with ADHD, we are a lot better at things than some of our neurotypical peers. One of those is creativity. Not to brag, but as you can see from my Instagram and my TikTok, I have a lot of followers on there for a reason. And that's because I just learned how to take a really creative thing that I like to do and I just doubled down on it. And I just did it, right?
So that's one of the strengths of ADHD, hyper focus on something that inspires you, and then you just do it.
You just do it. Now, where the downside comes when this is sometimes we can't break away from the hyper focus, right? So for
Mhm.
parents who are like having, new to parenting especially, right? Obviously with a child who's screaming or crying or doing whatever, right? That sound is going to be the hyper focus. And so a lot of parents will actually hyper focus on their children, which you think would be a great quality. But actually, what ends up happening is then they end up really giving up a lot on their own selves and they actually don't start maintaining their own home and they already struggle with that naturally. And then even just recreationally, right? Some of the things that actually kept them sane, they're not because they're so focused on parenting their child to the point where they've just kind of given up completely on themselves. And then they're kind of
Mhm.
like, how did my life get here?
Mhm.
So the challenges of ADHD parents, they are the same as their neurotypical peers. The difference is the level of intensity of how they feel with those things going on in their life, right? So there's this feeling in ADHD. It's called rejection sensitivity dysphoria. It's not exclusive to ADHD, but 99% of people with ADHD have this, right? 95 to 99%, depending on what research studies you look at. They actually want to eventually put it in the DSM to have it as its own mental health diagnosis, which I think would be awesome, just because I think it totally is. But essentially what this means is if you have perceived rejection, redirection, or the feeling of doing something wrong from somebody else, even if it's yourself doing it to yourself, you have a mass amount of dysphoria. So it's not just like a disappointment. It's not just, oh, I should have did better with that. It is literally like a shame storm that you feel. And the more it happens, the more it's just going to bring your entire mood down. Some people even say it feels physically painful. So it's
Mhm.
kind of like, with your neurotypical peers, they might be frustrated or they might be annoyed with things and, they will be tired because obviously sleep deprivation. People with ADHD, we're going to feel like we are just like the worst people on the planet because we can't keep up.
I imagine that can show itself in many ways. Just the tendency to beat yourself up.
The negative self-talk in ADHD adults is so real. Honestly, and I find it's because a lot of times, whenever negative self-talk happens, I think it's because of the adults in your life previously when you were a child. These are the things that either were said or at least it was a vibe that you got, right? So these are things
Right.
that you're speaking through that you've heard before. Um, so a lot of times I'll hear some people will say something like, they feel like a broken person or something like that. And that's usually because they've heard that at some point in their life, or they've picked up on that vibe at some point in their life, that this is what a broken person looks like.
Yeah. And when you become a parent, that's really important. Your self-esteem and what you're transferring to your kids.
Oh yeah, I mean, how you speak about yourself is
Yeah.
exactly how your kids are going to speak about themselves in the future.
So, for instance, my mom, she never restricted my eating, but there was always talk about, oh, yeah, I'm feeling fat, or I'm fat, and so and so's fat, and
Yeah,
this and that. And yeah, that's where we learn.
exactly.
And on the one hand, it's not that I'm eating disordered, but it's there.
Like even when you know it objectively, it isn't true. It still comes up because if you've been told it so many times, not to get too deep into it, but it kind of comes
Right.
down to people who are, so this is one of my ADHD hyperfocuses I went down one time, but it kind of has to do with like people who like have been in cults before. There's always like little inklings of things that you catch yourself still doing because of what you've been preached your whole life.
OCD is a good way to look at anxiety.
Yeah.
I feel this way, now I'm going to act this way. And in order to get out of that cycle, it takes a lot of work. So I've been looking at a lot of your social media,
Mhm.
and I've heard you mention more than twice this misdiagnosis in women
Mhm.
of bipolar, where it perhaps should be ADHD.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting one. So what I learned while opening my practice is I got a big influx of adult women with ADHD, and a lot of them have had a misdiagnosis in their life or believe they had a misdiagnosis, and they were coming to us for a second opinion of ADHD instead of bipolar disorder. What we ended up finding was a lot of these doctors, they only sat with them for maybe about 10 or 15 minutes. They heard there was maybe a little bit of mood instability, as they labeled it, and they didn't really assess further, or they did one bipolar screening.
Really?
Which, if you do any sort of screening, I always take them with a grain of salt until you've actually worked with someone. But a lot of times, these doctors are giving you diagnoses like this right away, right? Especially with the psych eval, where you're just coming in to see what's going on, and you'll
Uh-huh.
get these labels that aren't often even explained to you. And so a lot of these women will have these diagnoses, and it'll carry with them for years, and they'll be on medication for bipolar disorder, and nothing seems to be. And also, when you get into it, there isn't the depressive episode of bipolar, so they're wondering like what is going on. So one of the reasons that this happens sometimes is with ADHD hyperactiveness. Sometimes people look at that as a manic episode, right? And if you think about it, it looks kind of similar on the surface until you get really into it. Because in a mania episode, we feel really good. We're probably moving faster. We're probably talking faster. We're also maybe spending a little bit more money, right? So the thing is with ADHD, that's kind of like our base. So we're not in a manic state, but we're at a more hyperactive state. So if you
Uh-huh.
look at, a questionnaire that says, do you go on spending sprees? That is a super subjective question. And so to me, it's like, yeah, I overspend on Amazon a lot and I just buy things, but that's not the same thing as a manic spending spree.
Right.
Um, and so what'll happen a lot of the time is even when I do screeners for bipolar disorder, uh, they'll screen positive for the bipolar screening, and then they'll also screen positive for the ADHD screening. And sometimes they come in, there's actually nothing wrong with them at all.
And when you say nothing wrong with them at all, in other words, neither diagnosis would fit. It's fine. I never thought of that. Hyperactivity mimics mania.
It can mimic it, and it can look like it kind of on the surface in a way, right?
And so the point is the treatment is different. Bipolar and ADHD, and if you're misdiagnosed, you're
Well,
not
the
going to
thing too,
improve.
so
Hmm.
I don't advise anyone to get on meds or not. I more so say talk to your doctor about it. But I will say that with ADHD, a lot of the time, you get on an ADHD med and it probably isn't going to work. And that's going to be probably like your worst case scenario if you don't actually have ADHD. Usually,
Uh-huh.
there's a few exceptions to that too. But if you get misdiagnosed, I'm also talking about from the perspective if you're not diagnosed actually with bipolar. If you have bipolar and you end up getting on a stimulant, what happens is a lot of time they have very negative side effects,
Hmm. I would think
which could
so.
be dangerous. But if we're talking about it from the perspective of we think you have ADHD, you don't have ADHD, and you also don't have bipolar disorder, the meds are probably just not going to work, or you might feel some slightly mild side effects that then you just kind of get off of usually, right? Especially if you're, and that's also with the context of being monitored closely by a doctor and a therapist when you first start medication, which I always recommend. If you get misdiagnosed with bipolar disorder and get on those meds, a lot of the time, sometimes those can cause brain damage. It can be very damaging depending on what they're prescribing you.
And do you find when your practice is working with teens, you can have effective treatment for ADHD without meds?
You can, absolutely, right? So what I will say is there's a lot of people with parents who they are concerned to put their child on meds. And if you go into the debate within the ADHD community, you will hear a lot of people who will say that, you have to get your kid on meds and you have to do all this, you have to do all that. And statistically, if you look at the research, medication for ADHD in addition to therapy, they both work the best. And to me, that's a well done because I always say two is better than one. If you also look at the research, if you're only going to go with one or the other, therapy is usually the building block of what's going to happen. Now, depending on the person, you might need the medication to stabilize so that you can then go build the skills because sometimes you can't build the skills without the foundation of the medication being there. But some kids can actually build the skills with where they're at, right? And they can get accommodations in place and things can work out pretty well. With that being said, there are plenty of kids who are going to need medication too. So I would say maybe go into it with an open mind. But if you are afraid to, get your kid on meds, because there is a lot of information out there. Some of it is misinformation, some of it is real life. I think that a lot of people who are talking about this stuff nowadays, I don't think they lived through the 90s and 2000s. When I was a kid in, kindergarten, first grade through fifth grade, and even middle school in like 2007, 2008, where I would see kids who were over medicated and I would see kids who were falling asleep in class because of their medication, because those kids were labeled a problem. And in order to solve the problem, we're just going to knock them out and they're just going to be not there, right? And a lot of these kids are the ones who ended up dropping out of school. They ended up having substance abuse problems later in life because they were labeled that child so early. We just knocked them out throughout a lot of their childhood in class. They just weren't a problem to anyone else. So I do think that we've made advancements with medication, but I also can tell you that I grew up in that era where I was seeing this happen actively. So if parents are concerned to go on meds, I always say maybe try therapy for 2 or 3 or 4 months. If you don't see results from the therapy, maybe that's where we'll open the discussion to then, seek a medication evaluation. So I wouldn't wait years on end, but I also, if you're really that concerned about it, let's start with the therapy and see what we can build first.
Justin, thank you so much. Been enormously helpful.
Thank you. I appreciate it.